Welcome to this past paper on the Cold War, and this time we're looking to explain the consequence of the Marshall Plan. As with all consequence questions, we are interested in starting with the Marshall Plan, but not talking about the Marshall Plan. What we indeed need to do is talk about what happened next. How did people feel about it? What effect did it have on the relations? And also, what did it make people do next? What did it lead to? So we're going to do that now. So let's just get a bit of background context about the Marshall Plan first before we go into the consequences. If you remember, the Marshall Plan was the brainchild of George C. Marshall. Here he is here. And because of the success of the Truman Doctrine and of the containment policy in Greece and in Turkey, they realized that they could use money to actually try and influence countries not to have to turn to communism. Instead, if US money could be used to redevelop countries, they might stay loyal to capitalism. So the plan started in April 1948, and it pledged support of 12.7 billion to countries who could apply for it, European countries. And the idea again was that we would try and stop countries turning to communism as a mechanism for developing their country. Instead, keep them loyal to capitalism. So what are you going to include in your answer for the consequences of the Marshall Plan? Well, there are a couple of options. You could go with Stalin's reaction because he creates Comecon as a reaction to Marshall Plan. You could also go with the Marshall Plan. One consequence is that it actually worked and it was very successful in Europe and it had positive effects. So you could go with one of them. Let's have a look at the Stalin reaction one first with Comecon. Well, of course, Stalin hates it. He doesn't like it at all. He blames the US for trying to spread their imperialistic ideas through dollar imperialism. That's the nickname he gives it. He says you're trying to use money to buy friends. And so as a result, he stops the satellite states from being able to apply. They're not able to get that aid. But of course, they need that aid because they're still struggling after World War II. So what does he do? He creates Comecon instead. And this was in 1949 in January. And of course, the rules were very clear. You could only be in Comecon if you were a communist country. You had to trade through the USSR. You could not trade with the West. And of course, the countries that get that, then they have to work together for mutual cooperation. So Comecon was a result of the Marshall Plan. That's a clear consequence. You could do that one. Or you could talk about maybe the fact that the Marshall Plan works as a consequence. And you could say that it helped give money to nations that needed it. Their economies were bolstered by about 25% in productivity. And the proof was in the pudding. Those countries didn't turn to communism. They, in fact, stayed as capitalist countries, which frustrated Stalin, but was a huge win for the USA. It was a massive propaganda victory for capitalism. But then it did also, on the other side, show that the Novikov telegram was right. If you remember back to the Novikov telegram, it said that the US would use its money to dominate the world. Well, this just proved it right. It did. And of course, America got incredibly rich from the plan because all that money going into the economies of Europe, they bought American goods. So it was a win-win for America, really. But really, you can say it was a success, and that's a consequence of the plan as well. So whichever one you choose to do is up to you. What I would suggest is that you have a look at your notes, have a look at what's on the screen, and then take a moment to pause and choose one of the consequences to write about in lots of detail, and we'll come back and unpause it when you're ready. So, which one did you go with? Well, I'm going to go with Stalin's creation of Comecon. I particularly like that one. I think that's quite a nice direct consequence because it is the next event in the process. So I've started off with the usual way, and I've said one consequence of the Marshall Plan was Stalin's creation of Comecon in January 1949. So now I need to just say, well, why did that lead to Comecon? Why is that a consequence? And then what is the consequence? What happens next? So let's start off with the why. Well, Stalin was frustrated with Marshall aid because not only was Western Europe likely to develop quicker than the East, leading to a propaganda victory for the US, but he also saw this as evidence that the US wanted to dominate the world using its economic power. He labeled this dollar imperialism and forbade the satellite states from applying for Marshall aid and confirmed trade with the West was banned. So there's one little part. But what's he going to do next then? In response to the Marshall Plan, Stalin then created his own organization called Comecon in January 1949 to facilitate economic cooperation with communist nations only, with all trade going through the USSR. And this had the further effect of creating an economic divide in Europe now, that the Soviets support Eastern Europe and the US supports Western Europe with little interaction between them. You could even finish with a flourish. You could say, and the Cold War goes on and gets stronger or something like that. But that's the point, is we've just talked about we've come up with our point. We've talked about what Stalin felt about it and why he's not happy with Comic-Con, and then what he does next. Why he's not happy with the Marshall Plan and what he does next. So we've got the full flow there. That's quite nice. And it doesn't matter if you do what he did first and why he did it afterwards. It doesn't matter what order you put them in. As long as you've got that in there and you're talking about why it's a consequence and what it leads to. Well, thank you. I hope that was helpful and that helps you with that question.